After directing Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Spielberg was the hot new up-and-coming director who could do no wrong. After delivering hit after hit, studios gave him free rein on a movie. He decided to collaborate with Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, who wrote movies such as Back to the Future, to make a bonkers war spoof. He cast a sea of talented actors, both comedic and dramatic, with people ranging from John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, and John Candy, to Christopher Lee, Robert Stack, and Toshiro Mifune. The result is probably the most bonkers movie in Spielberg's catalog, for better or for worse. The movie was panned critically upon its release, proving that Spielberg is not the Teflon director he was thought to be. The movie follows different residents of Hollywood who scramble to defend themselves against the Japanese military following the events of Pearl Harbor. Hey guys, and welcome to Garage Movie Reviews, where we just talk about a random movie that's on my mind. I've never seen 1941. It's one of the few in Steven Spielberg's catalog that I haven't seen. You know what they say about Steven Spielberg: heart of a child, brain of an adult. And I feel like the more his catalog grows, and the more movies he makes, like Bridge of Spies and The Post, I feel like his childlike heart is wilting. So I figured, why not go back to the 1970s, where it was the golden age of Steven Spielberg's catalog, along with the 1980s. So that's what I did. Has a 5.8 on IMDb, Metascore in the 30s, panned critically upon its release. Did I care? No, I did not. And I didn't know what to expect with this movie, and I think if I had to put one sentence to this movie, this is basically Steven Spielberg's audition tape for Indiana Jones. This was prior to the first Indiana Jones. So this movie is like as if he gave his audition tape to Paramount Pictures, and they said, Stevie, this is great, but turn it down 2 notches. But let's go through the movie real quick. The movie opens, and you have a very tongue-in-cheek joke. You have the actress who was the first victim of the Jaws movie swimming in the ocean, and you hear the Jaws theme. And you expect there to be a shark, only to see that it's a Japanese submarine. So right off the bat, this is a very different angle for a Steven Spielberg movie doing meta comedy. That's something I've never seen from a Steven Spielberg movie. He does put a few Easter eggs. Something like Indiana Jones, the hieroglyphics in the background have C-3PO and R2-D2, which is a subtle nod to his good friend George Lucas. But this is a very on-the-nose reference right off the bat. So I'm like, okay, what am I in for here? As this submarine scoops up this naked, skinny diver, the Japanese are looking at this woman's ass and saying, Hollywood! It did feel very much like, okay, I feel like the angle we're going here is almost like a National Lampoon's comedy. And when you see the first poster of the film, the original poster of the film, it really does look like a National Lampoon's movie where it has that caricature of all of the big actors in the movie. So I'm like, maybe we're in for a kind of National Lampoon's kind of vibe. And then early on in the movie, you're introduced to one of the characters who's an aspiring dancer, and he works at this diner. They're kind of doing a play on Grease, where it's kind of like a musical, and they're trying to cook while dancing, but everything is kind of going to shit. And then the diner kind of erupts in a fight.
Look out, Wally! Watch it, look out, Wally!
And what that reminded me of was in Indiana Jones 4. There's a scene where Indiana Jones is talking to Mutt in a diner, and there's that one chunk that really feels oddly placed in the movie, where all of the greasers are standing up and they're about to get into a fight with all the jocks, and then it erupts into a big brawl, and it kind of doesn't feel like Indiana Jones. It kind of feels a little too self-aware.
Get that greaser!
That's kind of the tone of this whole movie. I feel like this movie is just all over the place, and I mean that in the best possible way. This is basically Steven Spielberg going apeshit, probably high off his ass on some kind of cocaine or something, and just doing whatever the fuck he wants. The humor here is very inconsistent. At some points, I felt like I was watching something like Airplane. It's kind of like these dad jokes, but in a very straight environment, almost like jokes that are in a real movie. There's like a part where a family is eating dinner, and they just say, "Honey, stop playing with your food."
See, Douglas, will you please take your gas mask off? You know that is no way to eat your soup!
I felt that was a very Airplane-like joke. But then you get jokes that kind of feel like I'm watching the Three Stooges. There's a part where the Japanese are trying to invade. This takes place in the Christmas time, and the Japanese soldiers are trying to disguise themselves as Christmas trees.
I'll be doggone. I reckon I'm gonna have to try that again.
And then at other points, you get these random non sequitur jokes. There's a part where a man and his friend are in a Ferris wheel, and they're on the lookout for Japanese people, and the man is very scared of heights, and the other guy is constantly reminding him of the fact that they're high in the sky. And at some point, the guy gets fed up and says, "Shut up! Just shut up!"
Now don't say another word.
Scared of heights, huh? Me too.
Like a puppet just pops out of nowhere, and he starts saying every line of dialogue through the fucking puppet. So this movie, comedically, is just all over the place. So at some points, I was watching Airplane. At some points, I was watching The Three Stooges. At some points, it felt like random, like I'm watching fucking Eric Andre or something. And that's kind of what I like about this movie. This movie doesn't really have any rules. Even the story of this movie doesn't really have rules. It takes place on one day in 1941, and it's just this whole town overreacting as the Japanese are taking over. And what's funny about this movie is that in this huge chaotic mess, the Americans are inflicting more damage on themselves than the Japanese are, which is basically a very good message for today's America on how paranoia is America's biggest enemy after all. So I think that's what kind of resonated with me through this movie. Through all that chaos and weirdness and randomness of this movie, I like the fact that it's basically America kind of eating itself alive.
What the hell do you people think you're doing? You're acting like a bunch of Tojo stooges. What do you want to do? Put Yamamoto in the White House? The Axis is crawling like a slime all over Europe. I can't believe it, Americans fighting Americans.
And that reminds me that when Steven Spielberg showed this movie to his good friend Stanley Kubrick said that this was an excellent movie, however, he doesn't think it to be a comedy. Which I can kind of understand where he's coming from because of that angle, I guess. Where it's more a movie about how in the face of war, America is going to be its own worst enemy. But regardless of what Kubrick says, in its tone, this movie to me was very reminiscent of Dr. Strangelove, which is a movie by Stanley Kubrick, interspersed with these jokes that feel very National Lampoons. There's a part where the soldiers are seeing women for the first time and they're drooling all over the women, where they're literally on their knees worshipping the women like they're gods.
I want you! Woman! 8 o'clock! I can't take it! Just line up! I love you! Tonight! I love you!
And that's something I need to praise the movie for. There's so much fucking commitment to these jokes, and so much confidence in the joke, that Spielberg just leans 100% into it. I'll give you an example. There's this whole reoccurring joke that this character lives in a militarily strategic spot, and he has to kind of give up his house to the American military, and he's like, take care of it, don't damage it too much. And sure enough, it gets damaged along the way. And at the end, he's like, damn it, I want to celebrate my Christmas. And he goes to put a wreath on the door.
Now, we're not going to let a bunch of treacherous enemy killjoys ruin our Christmas.
As a viewer, you're expecting like, oh, the door is going to fall over. And this guy puts a hammer to the nail, and the door doesn't fall over. The wall goes to fall over. So you're like, okay, the fucking wall is gonna fall over. And then they're like, no, the house is gonna crumble. So you're like, okay, the fucking house is gonna crumble. But it's not enough. Steven Spielberg legit takes a house and throws it off a fucking cliff. And as a viewer, you watch that and you're like, holy shit, how fucking committed were they to this fucking joke? It reminded me of sketch comedy. And yes, it's because of the cast members of John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd and John Candy, who was on SCTV. Sure, that reminded me of sketch comedy, but when you watch sketch comedy, it usually starts off with a nugget of an idea, and they just keep exaggerating it to the point of absurdity. Not just limited to SNL, even stuff like Mad TV back in the day, and Key and Peele, which I noticed does that very much.
Man, I said. I said big. I said big.
And in the midst of all of these fucking gags, the production value is at its highest. Like, this looks like a very expensive movie. When there's scenes of John Belushi's character flying, they actually filmed a plane flying. And beautiful miniatures are used in this movie as well.
Quit moving around!
As I said, the house crumbling at the end. It looks like a very expensive movie, and a lot of thought was gone into the high production value. Also, the dance sequences are fucking outrageous in this, and they're such a marvel to look at, how it integrated real talented dance performers with comedy. And through that bombastic jokes and miniatures and airplanes and dances, somehow Steven Spielberg's heart still manages to shine through in this movie. And a lot of that I credit to John Williams' score, which I think this is probably one of John Williams' most underrated scores in here. It's such a great tribute to World War II action serials and movies like The Dirty Dozen and The Great Escape and those kind of movies, very reminiscent of those scores with that iconic march that John Williams does so well. And Spielberg has a deep romanticization of the 1940s, the bar sequences and the fighting and stuff like that. We all know that Steven Spielberg is a romantic of that era because his next movie would be Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Whereas Indiana Jones kind of feels like an action serial, I would say that this movie feels like a parody of a propaganda picture. Almost like a Looney Tunes propaganda movie, if you will. Some of my favorite gags in this, there's a very edgy joke in this. John Candy is riding a tank with a black man, and he throws chalk in the face of the black man, giving him white face, and some malfunction happens in the tank. Dust goes off in John Candy's face, where he becomes blackface, and they share a good laugh at that expense. John Belushi as a complete caricature of this hotshot pilot. Every time he lands in some random area, he enters the room, and he's got that cigar in his mouth, and he's taking everything and throwing it at the walls. Kind of reminded me of Paul Rudd's character in Wet Hot American Summer, where everything just felt like a complete caricature of what a douchey teen would feel like. This is a complete caricature of what a hotshot pilot who does things by the seam of his hip kind of does. And there's this great moment in the aftermath of the dance brawl that goes on. Everyone is on the floor, passed out, and there's this huge, elaborate Rube Goldberg machine kind of going on.
If you had a good time, we're going to be boogie-woogieing our way right out across the street soon, so stay tuned to this station, and we'll bring you some news. Next week we'll be back. Have a good time.
This is definitely a cheesier Steven Spielberg movie. I want to talk about the legacy of this movie because I have a lot to say of what this movie holds. Are people going to remember this movie? Well, I hope so, because it's a pretty good movie in my opinion, despite getting mixed to very negative critical reception upon its release. I feel like it has enough charm, and I was like kind of bored of Spielberg's catalog. I feel like Ready Player One, despite being an homage to 80s culture, kind of lacked a little heart. And then you have Spielberg making movies like The Post and Bridge of Spies, very Oscar-nominated films. And I just wanted that awe-like inspiring wonder of a Steven Spielberg movie, and this movie delivered on that. So I have this movie on Blu-ray, and I'm surprised I found this movie on Blu-ray, given how not popular this movie actually is. But perhaps because the name Steven Spielberg is attached, they were able to release this on Blu-ray. There's two versions in this, the theatrical version and the extended version. This was my first time watch. I watched the extended version. I don't know how it compares to the original version, but I was looking at the version on streaming, and the runtime was even shorter than its theatrical version, which is due to the fact that YouTube and Amazon censored parts of the movie for being too offensive. I don't know which parts they censored. There's reoccurring uses of World War II racial slang, stuff like yellow belly in reference to a Japanese person, and just calling Japanese people Japs. I would think YouTube would want to cut those parts out, despite it being a complete farce of America during World War II, which I understood, but I'm afraid that the average internet activist wouldn't understand upon watching this movie. The term yellow belly for an Asian was always offensive even during World War II. So when these buffoons say it in this movie, they're not promoting the use. They're saying, hey, look at these buffoons, they use that term. This movie is also, I think, panned critically upon its release because it deals with Pearl Harbor. And this movie was released in 1979. Pearl Harbor was in 1941. That leaves only about 40 years between the events of Pearl Harbor and the release of this movie. So I feel like it was still pretty fresh in everyone's mind. Imagine if they did a movie in the style of 1941, but with 9/11, then it would be kind of strange. And even 40 years after 9/11, people would still be a little, might be a little too soon. As a matter of fact, Steven Spielberg wanted Charlton Heston and John Wayne in this movie, and they both refused for that reason. And I feel like this movie was panned critically for that reason. I'm not dismissing the events of Pearl Harbor, but it was also 100 years ago, so the lens I'm seeing it through is different from the lens of an audience member back when this movie was released in the 70s. I can see why people might get upset, but to me, the events of Pearl Harbor, they're not making a joke out of Pearl Harbor, really. It's kind of just like a catalyst for the events in this movie to occur. This movie begins and it's after the events of Pearl Harbor, so it's not really It's not really poking fun at Pearl Harbor, in my opinion. But anyway, that's what I think of this movie. I had a lot to say about this one. Jeez, I've been talking for a half an hour here. Hopefully I can edit it down to a reasonable time. But guys, if you haven't seen 1941, go check it out. Tune in for Garage Movie Thoughts, where I'll be exploring another piece of Stephen King media, whether that may be a movie or perhaps a video game. I'll catch you guys around.
Universal Pictures and Columbia Pictures present an 18 production of a Steven Spielberg film, 1941.